The top 10 most significant events and influential people in Canada between 1919 and 1945. In my opinion, one of the most important events in Canadian history was the Persons Case. So, a bit of background. Women were able to vote in elections and hold political office, but they were not allowed to be in the Senate because they were not legally considered persons. So, under Section 24 of the British North American Act, it stated that only qualified persons were able to be part of the Senate. And the famous five petitioned the government about the interpretation of the persons. So, according to Section 24, of the British North American Act, a qualified person was defined as a minimum of 30 years old, they own a minimum of $4,000 in property, and they live in the province of which they were appointed to the Senate. So, four prominent Canadian women activists were invited to Edmonton by Emily Murphy, and we'll get into who she is a little bit later. So, they ended up sending a petition to the Governor General, and then the Supreme Court of Canada had to then vote on whether qualified persons included women. And then on April 24th, 1928, it was decided that Canadian women were not considered persons. And then on October 18th, 1929, the Privy Council in England eventually reversed the decision, concluding that women were considered persons in Canada. Emily Murphy, so she was born on March 14th, 1868, and then she died on October 27th, 1933. She was a writer, journalist, and magistrate. And then in 1916, she became a magistrate after she attempted to attend the legal proceedings of 7 women who had been arrested for being prostitutes, but it wasn't seen as being for proper company, so she was eventually kicked out of the proceedings. And then she was never appointed to the Senate because she unfortunately died after women were finally considered persons. But she did initiate the Persons Case with her invitation to the rest of the famous five to petition for the Governor General for the meaning of the persons. Nellie McClung is another one of the famous five. So she was born on October 20th, 1873, and died on September 1st, 1951. She was a suffragist, legislator, and author. In 1941, she fought in a liberal campaign against Sir Rodman Roblin's conservative government because they refused suffragette rights for women. So she also fought for prohibition and then rights for women, amongst other things. And before her death, she wrote her autobiography in Victoria, British Columbia. Henrietta Edwards was another one of the famous five, and she was born on December 18th, 1841, and she died on November 9th, 1931. She also did not become part of the Senate because she died 2 years after women were legally considered persons in Canada. So she studied art in New York City, having to turn to private lessons because she was ineligible for art school in Montreal because she was a woman. So she also launched women's work in Canada, and then she studied law, specifically those pertaining to women and children, and then she created the Dower Act. And because she was the first to sign the petition, the petitioner is actually called Henrietta or Edwards versus the Governor General. Irene Parlby, born January 9th, 1868, and she died on July 12th, 1965. So she was elected president of the ALEX of the United Farmers of Alberta, which was a provincial party. So after the UFA became a political party in 1921, she became a member of Legislative Assembly, meaning she sat in the House of Commons for Alberta. So she became the women's minister, and she also passed many successful and unsuccessful bills. So Louise McKinney, the fifth and final member of the famous five. So she was born on September 22nd, 1868, and she died on July 10th, 1931. She also did not become a part of the Senate because she did also die 2 years after women were considered persons. So she was the first woman elected to legislature, which happened on June 7th, 1917. And her platform for her election included prohibition and social welfare for immigrants and widows. She was also the vice president of the Imperial Order of Daughters of the Empire after winning the Persons Case. So I chose this event because women becoming persons in Canada is a big deal because before that they were not considered persons and couldn't be part of the Senate. So these women also dominated in a field where that was predominantly male dominated, and I think that is very important to Canada's history. So the discovery of insulin, which happened in 1922 by Sir Frederick Banting, Charles Best, John James Rooker McLeod, and James Bertram Collip. So this is used for the treatment of diabetes mellitus, and it was discovered at the University of Toronto after Banting suggested a new approach. So he suggested that they isolate islet cells from dogs, and then they inject the islets back into diabetic dogs. So they isolated the islet cells by blocking the pancreas, hoping that secretion would continue, and then they could isolate the islet cells. So Banting and McLeod won a Nobel Prize for the discovery, actually, showing that like Canada actually can have scientific discoveries. So the Second World War, which happened from 1939 to 1945, is also a very big moment in Canadian history. So Germany attacked Poland on September 1st, 1939, and then the same day England and France declared war, but Canada waited about 8 days a week before declaring war on September 9th, 1939. So they sent one division to Europe despite mounting pressure against conscription overseas, because people really didn't want conscription and being sent away overseas against their will, basically. So, and then they rapidly grew because conscription did happen in June of 1940. So, action that happened during the Second World War. So, also, Canadians were very frightened by the defeat of France and Belgium by Germany. So, very little action was also seen in the first years of the war. Canada didn't really get to prove itself that much. But in 1943, the Canadian Army led an unsuccessful raid in Dieppe, and in 1941, there's also an unsuccessful defense against Hong Kong. But the Sicilian campaign was the first action the Canadian forces saw, and they actually got to prove themselves as a military. So the Normandy campaign onwards towards Germany. So this happened on June 6, 1944, and the Allied forces, well, that was France, England, and Canada, and I think the United States helped at some point too. Basically took the cap and they secured their hold back on France. So this was part of the D-Day deployments where they took Juno Beach and basically recaptured some of France. So during the Battle of Rhineland, the Netherlands were also liberated, and then after Oldenburg was taken, the Germans pretty quickly surrendered. The repeal of Prohibition. So Prohibition was repealed in 1919, and it started in Quebec and ended in PEI in 1948. But like dry areas continued throughout like locales in Canada. So Prohibition was started in 1901 during the First World War, and the United States had stricter rules than Canada. But the government in like Ottawa specifically stopped the importation of alcohol to provinces where alcohol was already illegal, and homemade alcohol and speakeasies popped up all over Canada where alcohol was illegally sold and consumed. And I think this is pretty cool because this is like a big step for Canada in re-legalizing this, and it can be applied to situations now like the legalization of marijuana. So the Great Depression. So in October 1929, the stock market, like Wall Street, crashed, and economists only theorized that that's what happened. There's definitely a lot of other factors. So the prairies were actually hit the hardest, and different parts of Canada were hit harder than others. And this was due to a drought in what is now known as the Dust Bowl. And then unemployment was also really heavy throughout the country, and the government refused to provide work for the unemployed. So the effect of the Great Depression on Canada. So population rates decreased due to lowered birth rates and less immigration. Though Canada was turning away Jewish people after they fled Germany to Canada during the Second World War. And then there were new ways to deal with the economy that were formed. And then new political parties such as the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation, the CCF, the Union Nationale, the Reconstruction Party, and the New Democracy Party. But communism was also outlawed. So the impact that the Great Depression had on the government, despite creating all these new political parties, the government had to take new responsibility for the economy and social welfare, and then they started the Bank of Canada, which R.B. Bennett's government started, and that regulated monetary policy. But then they also created the Canadian Wheat Board, which was created so that wheat could be marketed and have a minimum set price. And they also created the National Unemployment Insurance, which they called a scheme, but would basically just help unemployed people by giving them insurance. So the Great Depression shows that Canada is a resilient country and is one of the top moments because even in the darkest of times with mass unemployment, Canada was still able to come back and be the great nation that it is today. So the Treaty of Versailles in 1919 is where Canada gained independence from England, which is very, very important for obvious reasons. Because now Canada was its own country and had its own autonomy to make its own decisions. So the Treaty of Versailles was peace talks, and Adolf Hitler ended up undoing them prior to the outbreak of World War One. And Robert Borden fought for the Dominion of Canada to become independent from England, and this put Canada on the forefront of the international political arena. So the League of Nations, which was started in 1919 after the Treaty of Versailles peace talks, where Canada gained independence, it was eventually replaced by the United Nations after failing to keep the peace during the Second World War. But it's a really important moment in Canada because Canada was one of the founding members of this international peacekeeping society, and it provided Canada with a place to prove itself on the international arena after separating as a dominion from England, and it was one of the first places where Canada, after the First World War, could really prove themselves as a political entity. And they also played a part in the League's procedures and the linguistic and religious minorities in Europe and their treatment. So, Agnes MacPhail is one of the most significant people in Canada's history, especially for women, because she was the first woman to be elected to the House of Commons, and she was one of the first, well, she was one of two of the first women to be elected to the Ontario legislature. So, Agnes MacPhail was born on March 24th, 1890, and she died on February 13th, 1954. And she was on the House of Commons between 1921 and 1940, and the Ontario legislature between 1943 and 1945, but also 1948 and 1951. And she was the first female member of the Canadian League of Nations delegation, and she was a founding member of the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation, the CCF. She also fought for the rights of women, minors, immigrants, prisoners, and many other groups. But she was accused of treason after criticizing militarism and imperialism, and she advocated for farmers and rural populations, which was the basis of her platform. And then she fought for reform in the prison systems after seeing the conditions of the Kingston Penitentiary. So Igor Guzenko. So he was a Russian cipher clerk, and he worked in the Russian embassy. And in 1945, he discovers an espionage ring, and then he decides to defect after discovering that he and his family would be sent back to Russia. And he takes several important documents that document the actual espionage with him, and he presents these to the Canadian government, and they don't believe him at first. But then, when the government of Russia attempted and failed to catch him, the Ottawa finally took him seriously and put him into protective custody, and that's when the full scale of the espionage was actually discovered. So, 12 suspects were eventually arrested, and Igor Guzenko was given and his family was given a new identity. And this was a pivotal moment for international relations between Canada and Russia. And it's so important to understand why, Russia and Canada and the US have such different diplomatic relations, and this is one of the pivotal moments in these relations. So lastly, one of the most significant moments in Canadian history was when residential schools were made mandatory. So every Indigenous child between the ages of 7 to 16 were forced to go to residential schools. And these schools were established to assimilate Indigenous populations of Canada into regular society by isolating them from their lingual and cultural practices. And a lot of these children were kidnapped from their homes, and a lot of them ended up dying from tuberculosis and typhoid because of the terrible conditions in Canada. So this is really an important moment because someone made the decision that all these children had to go to these schools and die, and it wasn't significant then, but it's significant now as one of the most pivotal turning points in colonialism and the terrible things done to Indigenous people in Canada because of colonialism. Kill the Indian in the child. So this is said by Duncan Campbell Scott, who was the man who decided to make residential schools mandatory. With or without the royals, we are not Americans, nor are we British or French or void. We are something else, and the sooner we define this, the better.